You're listening to the Music Book Podcast with your host, Marc Masters.
Hey, thanks for checking out the Music Book Podcast. I'm Marc Masters. Written 2 books about music, No Wave, published in 2008, and High Bias, The Distorted History of the Cassette Tape, published in 2023. On this podcast, I talk to music book authors about how they get from their first idea to a finished book, and all the decisions they make along the way. So this time around, I got to talk with Howard Fishman. He's the author of To Anyone Who Ever Asks, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse, published in May of 2023 by Dutton. It's part biography, part detective story, as Fishman combs through the facts and myths behind singer and guitarist Connie Converse, who made music in the 1950s that went unreleased in her time, then vanished in the mid-70s at age 50, never to be heard from again. Fishman meets her family members, friends, people who saw her play, and much more, making the case that her music is important and unique, and painting a picture of a singularly creative person. As Howard writes, the more I listened to her music, the more my curiosity grew. The visionary, forward-looking quality of what Converse had been up to seemed to suggest the need to update the narrative of mid-20th century American song altogether. In short order, I stopped writing my own music and became devoted only to Connie Converse, to learning more about her, to piecing together her life, to spreading the gospel of her particular brand of genius everywhere and everyhow I could, to, eventually, inserting myself into the life she left behind to that point, that, at times, I felt that I'd become part of the plot. By the way, the first compilation of Connie's music, titled How Sad, How Lovely, came out in 2009. It's been reissued a couple times since then, but there's a new expanded edition coming out on March 26th on Third Man Records, overseen by Dan DeZula, who put out the original 2009 release. So check out Howard's book and then grab that record if you don't have it already. It's really amazing music. Any questions for me? Email me at musicbookpodcast@gmail.com. Check out our Instagram account, which is @themusicbookpodcast. And besides all the podcast services you can listen to this podcast on, we're also up on YouTube now, so check that out. So here's my conversation with Howard Fishman. Hope you dig it. A lot of times what I start out with is, how did this book come to be? Now that's somewhat explained in the book itself, because you start with when you first encountered her music and how you, not only did it strike you, really strike you when you first heard it, but her story struck you too, or what little there was of it, and you got obsessed with it pretty quick. But there's never a point in the book where you say, now I'm going to write a book about it. I don't think. I can't remember if you really explicitly say that or not.
Well, I don't know if I say it explicitly, but I do feel like the moment was when I went to visit her brother in Ann Arbor, and he showed me that filing cabinet of hers, where she left behind all of her writings and music and projects and everything. I think when I started exploring the contents of that cabinet, I just realized, okay, this is a book.
And were you kind of surprised that nobody had done that before? Or, I guess she still, even with that release out at the time, the word hadn't spread a ton by the time you heard about her, I guess.
I mean, the word still hasn't really spread.
Right.
You and I know who she is, and some people know who she is, but most people don't know who she is. And when I meet random strangers and they ask about what I've written, and I mention that I've written about Connie Converse, they don't know that name. So
Yeah.
I continue to, even though the book has been out for a little while, I continue to do podcasts and lectures and talks anywhere and everywhere that people will let me, because I won't, I feel like I won't rest until she's a household name the way that she deserves to be.
That's awesome. That's great. So at the point where you went to visit Phil, for people who haven't read the book, that's her brother who is kind of the keeper of her history to some extent, although weirdly he tossed some of her stuff, and we can get into that too. But he's been sort of the devotee of keeping her legacy alive and things like that. After you visited him, you started thinking of it in terms of a book. Did you pitch it soon after that, or did you still do a lot of kind of research and other things before you started actually presenting the idea to publishers?
Well, before this project came along, I had never written anything for publication. Uh,
Oh,
not,
really? Okay.
not even an article,
Oh, okay.
let alone a
Interesting.
book, let alone a biography. So this was a new field for me to be breaking into. I was
Mhm.
and still am a professional musician, but
Mhm.
this project this phenomenon of Connie Converse and feeling like I had been tasked to
Mhm.
with telling her story and getting her more recognition just made me start thinking in kind of fantastical ways. It's not that
Mhm.
fantastical to write a book, but for me, I
Mhm.
was, when what was I, 40 or so when I
Mhm.
started thinking about, I mean, it's kind of late in the game to be
Mhm.
thinking about writing a book for the first
Mhm.
time.
Sure.
So first I had to convince myself that this was really something that I felt that I could do. And then came the
Mhm.
process of figuring out, okay, how do I do it? I didn't even know how to pitch a publisher, but I did have some friends in publishing, and
Mhm.
their advice was, look, Howard, nobody will buy this book because you're a first-time writer writing about somebody that nobody's ever heard of. Or, like nobody
Right.
will buy the book. So the first thing you have to do is you have to establish your cred and you have to get
Mhm.
some recognition about her out there into the ether. So try to
Mhm.
place a magazine article, write about her for a magazine, try to get it placed, and use that as leverage to get yourself an agent. And then maybe you and the agent can figure out how to get a deal. So
Oh,
that's what I did. I wrote a magazine article, and the stars were aligned as such that it got published by the New Yorker. And
mhm.
that began the process of trying to sell the book. But what I always say is that this book that took me 12 years to write, 10 of those years were spent writing and researching completely on spec. I didn't have a,
Mhm.
a, a book deal, and
Mhm.
I had there was no guarantee that the book would ever see the light of day. But I was
Right.
determined that I was going to do it. So I did it and I got lucky.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
Yeah,
and you sort of had this driving curiosity that maybe even super like it sounds to me like you probably would have kept looking into her even if you
for
someone
sure.
came to you and said this can never be a book because
Yeah.
it was just that kind of level of interest basically,
I
right?
would have self-published it if I had to.
Yeah.
That
Uh-huh.
obviously that wasn't the ideal end game, and it
Uh-huh.
didn't turn out to be the end game, thankfully. But yeah, it wasn't about dollars for me or fame
Uh-huh.
or fortune. It was about getting out the word about Connie Converse.
That's cool. And so not having really done a lot of writing before, I'm curious how the process went in terms of approaching people and talking to, family members, people who had known her, people. Was that something that you found challenging or interesting, or did it get easier as you went on to contact people and say, did some people say, why are you doing this? Or, I don't want to talk, I'm just curious how the mix of all that went as Phil obviously was pretty receptive from the beginning, it sounds like, right? Or,
Her brother Phil was completely receptive from the get-go. He said, "I'll talk to you anytime. I'll tell you anything, and come out and visit me, and I'll show you all her stuff." He was completely cooperative. But from there, it got more challenging, and
mm,
it was hard for me because not only had nobody ever written about Connie Converse before, so every
mhm,
every person I talked to, it was breaking new ground. It was starting from
right.
scratch. But
Mhm,
also, many of the people that I contacted didn't know who I was talking about because Connie Converse was a nickname. Her real name was
mhm,
Elizabeth Converse. And when I would start to talk about Elizabeth's music making, they would say, Elizabeth didn't make music. You must be thinking of
right.
somebody else. So,
Uh-huh.
because so much of her life was private and secret,
Mhm,
almost, and she had these different phases of her life that were sort of discrete in terms of what she was focused on. So, the people that knew her in New York didn't know anything about what happened to her after she left New York and gave up music. The people who knew
mhm,
her in Ann Arbor, which is where she moved after New York, knew nothing about her chapter in New York trying to pursue a music career, etc.
mhm,
So, yeah, to answer your question, it was hard. It was almost all cold calls
mhm,
and finding names and contact information just by Googling and search engines and whatnot. I had a really good research assistant who helped me with all that. But a lot of it was
mhm,
calling up people cold and saying,
uh-huh,
introducing myself, saying I'm a writer writing about Elizabeth Converse. Would you be open to talking with me? Thankfully, a lot of people were, but then there were also people who didn't want to talk to me or were very careful about what they had to say.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's always a such an interesting process to go through talking cold calling. It's just like some people seem, I think, have a natural knack for it, but I think most people it's a weird, awkward thing
It's
to start
weird.
with, you know?
It's weird. Every time I would pick up the phone and make a cold call, I would get an adrenaline surge because
Right.
it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You have one shot. You have one
Uh-huh.
shot to
Uh-huh.
make your case. And if you don't do it well, you may not get the interview.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Now, for people who haven't read the book, there's a bit of a, to me, there's a lot going on in the book, but to me, there are sort of three big strains. One is her story, obviously. One is her music, which isn't separate from her, but you kind of, in order to sort of make the case for her, you have to often, not have to, I mean, you like to, and it worked out well, describe her music, analyze her music, talk about why it's important, talk about why would anybody be interested in someone that no one has heard of. And then there's your journey part of it, the research being part of the story, really, because you're uncovering a mystery. There's a detective story aspect to the whole thing. All of those I'd like to talk about in different ways, but the detective part I think is interesting. You know, you start with how you encountered the music, and then you start with how you got to meet Phil, and there's a chronology sort of to the whole making of the book that happens inside the book. And
Yes.
was that always something you thought you needed to? Was that the idea you had from the beginning to structure
No,
the book that way?
not
Oh,
at
okay.
all. The
Hmm.
initial idea was to write a standard biography, cradle to
Ah,
grave,
interesting. Uh-huh.
traditional biography.
Uh-huh.
And my agent convinced me that no publisher would touch that book for all the
Huh.
reasons that I've already mentioned.
Hmm.
There needed to be some kind of a hook because she's an
Hmm.
unknown figure. So I inserted myself into the story. I was having a hard time figuring out how to tell the story, and then I realized if I just started from the beginning of my own encounter with her music
Hmm.
and took it from there, then that would be a way to involve the reader and get the reader interested because they're finding out things, the reader's finding out things as I'm finding out things, as opposed to
Right.
just being told the story of her life, which may not be of interest to somebody who doesn't know who she is.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And I also think it's quite important, at least it drew me in, important for you to really describe how captivated you were right away, so that like it gives a reader something to be like, oh, okay, so this is somebody worth chasing down, and this is something worth being into. If somebody could respond to her music this strongly, then obviously, not obviously,
But I don't
but
think, I don't think I'm alone. I mean, people do make a,
oh yeah.
I don't, people make a
Mhm.
big deal about the fact that, oh, Howard, you got so obsessed with her and that's what makes the book move along. But so many people are obsessed with her.
Mhm.
So many people that hear her music and find out about her story go down the same rabbit hole that I went down and
Uh-huh.
become just transfixed by this crazy story and this genius of a woman. So I don't think I know I wasn't alone.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Was it an interesting process to be a subject matter in a book that you're writing, like try to think about how should I balance how much do I talk about, step by step process and also my responses to it, and how much do I pull back when I need to and be
Yes,
more about her?
for sure, for sure. And
Mhm.
I had a great editor at Dutton, which is part of Penguin Random House.
Mhm.
John Parsley was my editor, and I always checked in with him about anything that related to me in terms of just to get a reality check because I never, ever, ever wanted this focus to shift away from her. I never wanted to steal focus from her. So for example, there's a moment where I'm sitting in a kitchen with the daughter of someone who knew Connie Converse well when she was living in New York City, a woman by the name of Rita Chang. I was visiting her in her home outside of Boston, and we were sitting there listening to Connie Converse's album How Sad, How Lovely, and we have this very vulnerable, emotional conversation about what the music means to both of us. And as I was going through the final edit of the book, I said to John Parsley, maybe this shouldn't be here. This feels a little, uh, it's getting away from telling the story. And he said, no, 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 you really have to keep it there because these are the moments that keep the reader invested in, or I guess attached emotionally
Hmm.
to what's happening in not only her story, but your story. And
Hmm.
I just deferred to him whenever, and there were other times where he would say, no, you're right. This is too much of you. Let's
Hmm.
take it out.
Hmm.
So yeah, I just basically the long answer was what I just said. The short answer is I just had a good editor.
Right. That's cool. Now you mentioned that it's somewhat of a chronological book in terms of your journey into finding out more about her, but I imagine it's not the kind of book where you could have done all the research first and then started writing. I imagine you were probably writing a little bit and still discovering new things. Did that happen, or did you?
Mark, I was still writing when the thing was practically going to press. I was still making edits and changes.
Right.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
I drove my editor crazy with that stuff because I just continued to research, and every bit of pay dirt that I would hit in my research could change the entire story
Uh-huh.
because
Uh-huh.
wait a minute, okay, well that changes what this happened here, and this person knew that person, and oh, that makes sense, because the whole Connie Converse story is a puzzle that has all these missing pieces, and it still has missing pieces, but
Hmm.
as I was going along and as I was editing, more puzzle pieces would come in, and then it changes the whole picture now. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
even now I'm continuing to do Connie Converse research because I'm hopeful that there will be a revised edition one day in which I can insert even more puzzle pieces.
That's cool. Yeah, and I mean it's complicated on a number of levels because not only does that mean you had to always be sort of writing and rewriting as you went along, but you also were still trying to maintain a little bit of this kind of through line of, hey, I discovered this then, and that led me to that. And so then if you discover something that's about her that you already talked about, you kind of have
Correct.
to get that in there, but also not be like, it can't, yeah, I don't know. It just seems like a pretty complicated thing to pull off.
Yes, and there were times where I couldn't do it in the timeline of what I was finding out. For example, late in my research, I found a guy who was 100 years old, who was
Hmm.
still completely lucid, who
Uh-huh.
remembered Connie Converse from parties that he went to in the 40s in New York City. These
Mhm.
bohemian art parties during which he remembered Connie Converse being a social misfit, having a lot of social anxiety, being in a corner, typing on a typewriter while everybody's laughing and socializing and drinking. And at times, he remembers her climbing out the window and standing on the ledge outside these parties in this very precarious way. These amazing stories and recollections that
Uh-huh.
he had. And this was very far into my research. So I inserted those stories into the timeline of her years in New York, but they were not, if they were chronologically placed when I actually found them, they would be at the end of the book, which wouldn't make any sense. Is that sort of
Right.
what you're talking
Yeah,
about? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That just seems like so tricky. I mean, I think you pulled it off really well because there is sort of a forward motion throughout the book, but then there are also times when you have to say, oh, that also was mentioned by this person who I talked to last year or who I just talked to now or whatever.
Exactly.
And,
Exactly.
it's not an easy thing to do, but I think you did it really well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One of the interesting things too that you do along through the book that is, I think there's really kind of no other way to do it, is that you often have to do some speculating, and not necessarily speculating like on specific facts that you claim or don't claim, but sort of things like you you get somewhere and you say you could imagine her having heard that song while she was living in her apartment in New York, or you could imagine that she might have run into this person in Ann Arbor, or things like that, and I think it's a really cool way to kind of flesh out like possibilities of what happened to her rather than definitions of what her life. Ha I'm curious how you went about that. How often you thought, I could maybe speculate here, or sometimes you think, well, maybe that's a stretch to say that that could have happened, or
Yeah,
what that was like.
it's tricky. What you're talking about is very tricky because speculation is not something you really want to indulge in a biography. On the other hand, this is not a traditional biography,
Hmm.
and it's a book about somebody who has all these missing puzzle pieces about
Right.
which there just isn't a fact available. So in the vacuum of there being no fact, there are times in the book where I say things like, I can imagine these possibilities.
Hmm.
Or as I was researching or as I was thinking about this phase of her life, I could imagine her hearing this song or going to this place or meeting this person. But I tried to be pretty judicious about when I did that kind of thing. And also, there are times where I really did not speculate, where a lot of readers that I've heard from wish that I had, especially
Oh, really?
especially
Mhm.
with regard to her disappearance, her
Sure.
relationship to her family, things like that. Yeah.
That makes sense, but I mean, I think you did very judiciously, but I also think it surprised me in not only the fact that I mean, it made sense to do it because, like you say, there's puzzle pieces missing, and you sort of have to guess at a little thing. But I think it also gave this sort of sense of like you were almost kind of imagining what it was like to be her in a way because you were going to these places and you were getting to know her more and more and getting to know what people said about her character, which was a very strong one. And even though there were some contradictions, still we get a sense of exactly the kind of person she was. And it made more sense to me that you could imagine it because you were going to these, you were sort of inhabiting a little bit. It's less than like you found a bunch of articles about her and imagined what she was like. You were kind of like semi living it in a way.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it. And
Yeah.
it's a biography of sorts, but it's not really a biography. It has a biographical element, but it also has, as you say, a detective story element. It has
Mhm.
musical analysis as an element,
Mhm.
and then it has a kind of meditative element. It's almost,
Right.
like what I
Mhm.
would say is like a meditation on Connie Converse, if I can say that without sounding too annoying. Um, where, as you say, I'm thinking about, okay, what must it have been like in 1950 to be living in Greenwich Village among
Mhm.
these kinds of artists and writers and these kinds of clubs where you could go to hear this kind of music and these kinds of get-togethers? One can imagine having these kinds of feelings
Uh-huh.
about
Uh-huh.
being in that milieu. But again, hopefully judiciously and not in a way that is too off-putting.
Yeah, I think much the opposite. It drew me in more
Cool.
to have those imaginations and just sort of to try to embody her a little bit is a pretty cool way of doing it, I thought. We both mentioned the musical analysis parts, which I thought were really interesting and really compelling. And they're interesting in the sense that much like a lot of the rest of the book, there's very unique challenge to that because in a book on somebody who there are a lot of answers for and people have heard of, the musical analysis is often sort of descriptive or analytical, obviously, but which you do that. But you also have the strains of number one, you're trying to show this is why you should care about her. And number two, you establish early on that one of the compelling things about her music to you and to many people is that it was forward thinking. It kind of predicted some things that came, even though it was sort of she wasn't necessarily part of like the folk scene. So it had this kind of unique quality of being kind of almost weirdly futuristic and also sort of out of her time. So those are a lot of things to try to get into talking about one specific lyric or one specific melody or things like that. So that must have been kind of fun, but also challenging, I imagine, to do those sections.
Yeah, it was both of those things, fun and challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a trained musician, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not a musicologist. So I'm just speaking from my own experience as a musician. And although I'm not an expert, prior to hearing Connie Converse's music, if there's a subject that I invested an inordinate amount of time in, let's
Mm-hmm.
say from my late teens to the time that I heard Connie Converse for the first time, it was American music from the first half of the 20th century. So early jazz, early blues, early hillbilly music, early gospel, early pop, parlor songs, cowboy songs, that whole
Mm-hmm.
period of music.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like I knew, I feel like I know something about that from having
Mm-hmm.
listened to it a lot, having played it a lot, having lived in New Orleans and played with people that played all that music. So when I first heard her, as I say in the book, I almost didn't believe that she was real because she
Yeah.
combined all of these things in a way that
Mm-hmm.
was crazy to me.
Mm-hmm.
And how could I never have heard of her? Like it bothered
Uh-huh.
me. So that area of interest for me is what I brought to bear in terms of talking about her songs and what makes them unique. if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it was really, really interesting that way. And you do mention throughout parts of the book that as you were in this process of the researching and the talking to people, you were starting to learn some of her songs, perform some of her songs, have them performed and things like that. How do you think that sort of informed you in terms of like getting even more perspective on her and her music to actually be playing some of it?
Oh, yeah. Well, from a music analysis standpoint, one of my favorite quotes that I got for the book was from David Garland, who is the one who first played her music on his radio show, Spinning on Air. David said to me something like, it's similar to Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, where you hear the song and it just sounds like a great song, but then you
Hmm.
sit down to try to play it and you realize, oh, holy moly, like it's doing all of these weird things. But when you hear it, it doesn't sound weird. It isn't until you break it down that you understand how complex and sui generis it is. Same with Connie
Hmm.
Converse. The songs, when you hear them, they're little earworms and they just stick in your head. But when you actually
Hmm.
start to play them, you realize, oh man, these chord changes are weird. These harmonies are weird. The
Hmm.
structure of this song is weird. And that was my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's cool. You mentioned David Garland and how his radio show was one of the first things to make her music, public that way. One interesting decision I think you made that I thought worked really well, but I was curious how you came to it, is that at the beginning you tell us, well, I'm at a party and someone plays some of her music, and then our journey takes off, and one of the first questions I thought of was, wow, if she's so obscure, how did this person happen to have her music when you
Right.
were and it's at the end when you bring up Dan, is it Dzula? Is that
Yes.
it? Yeah, Dan Dzula, who happened to hear that radio show
Right.
and and went through all these machinations to kind of cling to that music, which could have just gone off in the ether and eventually put it all out. But you make that decision at the end of the book to put his story. Could you even say, a lot of people ask me, how is her music even available if she's been so obscure? And
Yeah.
at first I thought, well, that could have maybe worked at the beginning, but I actually liked how that ended up in the being more toward the end of the book. Do you remember making that decision and how you came to that?
You're the first version of the book had that in the beginning. You're
Okay, yeah, I
correct
thought
in
that might have
thinking that
happened.
it
Yeah.
could have been there, but it seemed right somehow to save it for the end as
Hmm.
just kind of this
Uh-huh.
surprise ending, this chance series of encounters and experiences that led to her being discovered. Sometimes I'm asked about the Connie Converse Renaissance or the rediscovery of Connie Converse. There's no rediscovery. There's no Renaissance. She was discovered in this century.
Right.
She was not discovered when she was playing music.
Hmm.
She was
Hmm.
obscure. So yes, it's amazing to think about how close she came to being completely erased.
Yeah. And I think it's a really kind of a neat structure you end up setting up because you set up that you heard her, then you go back through her past, and then chronologically, the next thing that happened in her story is that someone put out her music.
Right.
And then that kind of loops around back to the beginning of the book, as that's how you found out about it. I thought it worked out really well that
Cool.
way.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. And we were mentioning a little bit earlier about approaching people and talking to like her brother and her nephews and all, not only just people in her family, but people who are newer and things like that. How conscious were you of sort of a few of them, especially Phil, obviously, but a few others, of establishing them kind of as characters in her story, and also the ancillary thing that I always think of with that is the sort of the challenges of being honest about them while also not wanting, you're not out to get anybody in this book. You're not out to say that something bad was about any specific person. But and you became friends with some of the people, so you want them to like the book. But like there's even parts of Phil that are a little questionable, even though overall he comes off as a great character. So I'm just curious how you
I
approached
think
all
so.
that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. Phil Converse died before this book came out, and
Hmm.
there was no way to know when he was still alive because I hadn't made that turn yet that
Hmm.
the book was going to take the shape that it did, in which people become characters. Like, I mean, Phil is almost like a co-star of this book in terms of
Totally, yeah.
the way that his character is. He's really part of the story, and he's kind of the person that I don't know helps me along. And as such, like all of us, I learned that he is a complicated human being.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
there were some things that he told me, and I won't include any spoilers here, that
Mhm.
were disturbing to hear and
Mhm.
felt like they needed to be in the book. And then there were other things that he told me that I felt like shouldn't be in the book because they were, spoken in confidence or off the record or whatever. So I'm glad to hear you say that he comes across as a good guy because
Mhm.
that's what I think of him as. And I tried to be a good journalist in terms of just telling the reader what I learned,
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
here are the facts, you make your own
Mhm.
decisions.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're even right to, in some places, especially with him, you say, I'm including this because it's part of the story. You're kind of anticipating that someone might be like, why is this in here? And you say that sometimes, this is part of the reality of Phil or the reality of these people that I'm talking about. And I think that's a good way to do it. It worked well for
Thank you.
me, at least. We talked a little bit about your work with your editor and your revising and things like that, and obviously that you were writing up until the end. How did the revisions go otherwise? I mean, did you? It sounds like you probably worked over the book quite a few times
Yeah.
before it's settled. And also, was it hard to decide you were done? I wonder.
Yes, it was hard to decide. I mean, not to get too inside baseball,
Hmm.
but for a book like this, or I think most books, you have a first pass, a second pass, a third pass. It can
Hmm.
go, I don't know how many passes is a lot, but I think two or three passes at least before you get to the final thing. So we were in the third pass, which my editor felt was going to be the final one. And he sent it back to me. The copy editor had gone through it. Obviously, he'd gone through it. And he said, okay, now's your chance. You can make your final changes, and then that's going to be it. And I made my changes and I sent it back to him. And he said, Howard, Dutton Books, which Dutton has been around for, I don't know, since the 20s or 30s. Dutton is an
Hmm.
old imprint. He said, usually at this point in the process, it would be unusual for an author to make 100 changes or so. And a change could be, a punctuation mark or a misspelling or whatever. You have made 4,000 changes, which is the most changes in the history of Dutton. Um, but he
Wow.
said, I am going to have your back on this because I think all the changes that you have made are important and add
Mhm.
to the book. So,
Mhm.
congratulations for giving us a huge headache, and we're going to
Wow.
do our best to make all these changes before our deadline.
Uh-huh. That's cool. And were there ever any issues of length? Did you propose a length to begin with, or did they ask for a specific length? Or
No, no, I don't think they were expecting quite such a big book, but my editor never said it's getting too long. We need to
Mhm.
cut it back. He did at one point say, well, the appendices, if we trim the appendices, we could slim this down by about, 20 pages or something that might make a difference. But those appendices are so important to me.
Oh yeah.
There's an appendix that is her treatise about racial inequality in America. That
Mhm.
is just I just felt like it needed to be in there word for word so people could see,
Mhm.
what an intellect this woman was. And then there's yeah, the appendices were just
Mhm.
important to me, and so
Yeah.
he said we could cut them, and I said I'd rather keep them, and he said okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And my experience with a lot of people I've talked to about writing biographies in particular is like the temptation is to get everything in there you can, and then sometimes you can be like, well, maybe someone else could write the book about this part of their life or something. But you probably were pretty sure this is probably going to be the only Connie Converse book ever, so you want to get as much as you can in there, even though I'm sure there's stuff you couldn't include. But
Who knows? I would love to
yeah.
see other Connie Converse books. I mean, the thing about it is, what I always say is that if I had started writing this book now, I wouldn't be able to write it because all the people are dead. All the people I interviewed
Right,
are dead. I caught
right,
people
right.
who were in their 70s and 80s and 90s or
Uh-huh.
100, and those people are all gone now, pretty much. There might be a few still alive. So somebody starting from scratch today, I think it would be a different kind of a Connie Converse book, but I'd love to read it.
Hmm. Obviously the one of the hooks about her story is her essentially what is amounts to sort of a disappearance. Although, she left, it's not like, I mean, she, as far as everybody knows, she
Deliberate
left of her own
disappearance.
free will, so she
Yeah,
wasn't like kidnapped or something. But
correct.
still, there's so much mystery to what happened from a certain point of her life on, and to when she died or if she died, or all those kind of things. And you get
Yeah.
into a lot of that in the book. And it's funny because at first when I heard about her story, that part seemed almost unbelievable. Like, how can somebody just disappear? But then when you think about any random person, if you just plucked a person up and said what happened at the end of their life, it's a very good chance that people might not know, especially as people are passing away who knew her and things like that. But
Mhm.
this is all leading me to think: do you still are you still interested in? Oh, I'm sure you're still interested in, but do you still think there's more to be found out about that, or will it be harder and harder as time passes to get any new information on what might have happened?
I mean, who knows? There's people send me news items and
Hmm.
internet posts about some random car that was found on the bottom of a lake, that had the remains of a woman that looked like she might be her age and
Hmm.
her identifying characteristics, etc. Who
Hmm.
knows? Maybe she will one day be found and we'll find out what
Hmm.
happened to her. But I knew from pretty much the get-go that I was not going to write a true crime book about what
Right.
happened to Connie Converse. The most interesting things about Connie Converse aren't even the disappearance, or it's
Right.
it's her actual life is more fascinating
Hmm.
than the fact that she disappeared, which is saying something.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I'll leave that to other people. If there are
Hmm.
forensic people out there who want to go searching for her remains, I'll read about it, but I'm not going to
Sure.
invest time in it. Yeah,
Right. That's not the point, for
that's
sure.
not the
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You mentioning the appendices made me think of the great amount of photos and illustrations that you
Yes.
found. Was that all kind of part of the journey of every time you would encounter somebody new, they might be able to provide you some of that, or how did you go about collecting all of those?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were sourced from her filing cabinet, but then others I found through friends and relatives, which were just amazing to see.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I feel very, very fortunate that, I mean, Dutton just made a beautiful book.
Hmm.
The physical book with that huge color insert of photographs, over 100 photographs, makes me so happy. And, I know that there are people who have really enjoyed the audiobook because it includes snippets of her songs throughout, which
Oh,
they say is
nice.
a great
Hmm.
experience, but
Hmm.
they're missing the photographs. And on the other hand,
Hmm.
the people that read the book don't hear the music that's in the audiobook. So maybe it's a
Sure.
zero-sum game, but yeah, I feel very lucky that Dutton allowed me to have that many pictures in the book.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's just so cool to not only see her at different stages of her life and see how she was. You could almost see her interacting with people in some of the photos, which is cool. And then
Yeah.
also I love with a story like this has so much mystery that the smallest things can be such a big deal. Like she went on, not that this was a small thing, but she went onto a CBS TV show with Walter Cronkite, and the only, was sort of a thing you heard about, and the only physical proof of this is somebody took pictures off of the TV screen, basically, and you're not even sure who took those photos because it wasn't videotaped. There wasn't even videotaped then, I don't think, or if there was,
Mark,
they weren't archiving
it's
it.
totally crazy. Somehow in 1954, she got invited
Mhm.
onto the morning show hosted by Walter Cronkite. Not only is there no footage that exists, and as you say, the only evidence we have are those pictures which were taken of the TV set as the show was airing, but
Uh-huh.
when I contacted CBS Archives, they had no record of her ever being on the show, no release forms that were ever signed, no Elizabeth Converse, no Connie Converse anywhere in any of their records.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
This treads back a little bit back to some of the stuff we were talking about, but one of the things I'm always curious about with when I talk to any writer of a book is sort of your imagined reader. And obviously you don't want to narrow it down to like one type of reader, but you do have to kind of think about what do I have to explain to them that I can't assume is common knowledge and things like that. And this one's especially interesting because there's almost nothing you can assume is common knowledge, although you can assume things like, well, you bring up Bob Dylan, you don't have to go into history who Bob Dylan is or things like that. But I'm curious how much you were sort of thinking of trying to imagine being the reader as you were writing the book.
Yeah, I was really writing for the general reader. I was not writing for a specialized audience. I was not writing specifically for music heads or
Mm,
biography nerds. I was writing for the everyday reader, and I tried to keep the narrative and the language as such. Somebody who is just interested in a good story.
cool. Well, that's a relatively kind of a clear, basic way to like not basic in a bad sense, but like a nice simple way to think about it. That probably helped guide you pretty well
Yeah,
with
and the only person I really wasn't writing for, ironically, maybe is the Connie Converse obsessive, people who already knew about her. Um,
right, right.
because early on, I was kind of thinking about those people as I was writing, and my
Uh-huh.
editor said, if you write it for that audience, you're going to reach 100 readers. You know,
Right, right.
they may be appreciative of the fact that you're writing for them, but the
Hmm.
number of people who already know about Connie Converse is so small, you can't
Hmm.
write for them. You have to write for people who've
Right.
never heard of her before.
Hmm.
So that's what
Hmm.
I did.
Yeah,
And
that's
and I
cool.
think, that there has been some blowback from Connie Converse obsessives about
Hmm.
about, the way that I constructed the narrative and the things that I say in the book. And I'm sorry, but they can write their own book about Connie
Right.
Converse.
Exactly. I imagine you've had quite a few probably interesting bits of feedback or experiences since the books come out. I'm curious if you have any examples of things that have been really kind of cool experiences that have come from the book, either from somebody, responding to it in a way that you might not have imagined, or somebody, bringing you a story that you hadn't heard before about, or anything like that.
I'll tell you the most beautiful thing about the experience of the book now being out and me going out and doing talks, which I continue to do at schools and libraries and whatnot, is afterwards when I'm at the table signing books, people coming up to me and saying, I am an artist or I'm a musician or I have this creative practice that I gave up. And
Mhm.
as the result of hearing you talk and finding out about Connie Converse, I'm going to go home and do that practice. I'm going to
Mhm.
sit at my easel, or I'm going to sit at the piano, or I'm going to
Mhm.
revive my songs. It's so meaningful to me to have those kinds of interactions with people because they understand that the book is about Connie Converse, but in a larger sense, it's about what success and failure mean in America
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
how the creative practice is so often tied to winning or losing. And
Right.
you feel if you don't get the cash and prizes and you don't become viral, that you
Mhm.
failed as an artist. And so many
Mhm.
people put their art down and they never go back to it. And Connie Converse, she put her art down and she didn't go back to it. And
Uh,
that's a tragedy to me. And it's a
mhm.
tragedy for so many people. So the fact that the book is having this effect on people and inspiring them to re-examine what's important about making art,
Mhm.
that's been the best thing about it.
That is awesome. That is awesome. And I think you also, beyond even kind of a corollary of extension of that theme is that sometimes the best, most interesting, most individual, most like forward-thinking art is not going to connect
Right.
that way, because just by definition, almost it's it's too far ahead of its time, or it's just too out of, it's not part of a scene, it's not part of trends, and so it has a lot less likelihood to even. But I mean, if nobody's making that stuff, we don't move on. We
That's
don't
right.
find new things in art. And so, yeah,
That's
it's
right.
pretty,
Yeah.
yeah, pretty amazing. Well, thanks so much for talking to me about it. I just love the book. You did a
Oh,
great
thank
job
you,
with it.
Mark.
And it's great to hear about how it all got put together. And I'm glad that it's sort of this living thing for you too. It sounds like people continue to be interested in it, which is awesome. I mean, not that it only came out a couple years ago, but still sometimes, that can be enough for people to stop caring. But I'm glad to hear that you're still getting a lot of interest in it.
Thank
Stuff like
you.
that.
Thank you. Yeah. And thank you for having me on. And now I got to go
Yeah.
read your book,
Oh, cool. Yeah. Well, love to hear what you think
which
of it.
I'm looking forward to. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
The Music Book Podcast is produced, edited, and hosted by Marc Masters. Our theme music is by the great band Savak. Our logo was designed by Walter Carlton. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating and a review wherever you hear it. And thanks so much for listening.